to Dopieralski for hosting this training session. Thank you very much.
Oh, hello everybody. We will try to learn to JavaScript based on our experience with Python. My name is Dopieralski. I work in Allegro Group in Poland. I work with our system administrators to create tools for them to manage data centers. And we are using a lot of different technologies, and JavaScript, XJS, jQuery among them. Today we will try, well, we will definitely do it. We will explore JavaScript, see how horrible language it is and how beautiful language it is. And we will use our knowledge of Python to do it really fast, so that we don't have to dig through books and through all this documentation. We will just see what's different in JavaScript than in Python. And the idea that Python is very similar to JavaScript and that you can use your knowledge of Python to learn it is from Jonathan Fine. He's the original author of this tutorial, and he has delivered this tutorial last year and 2 years ago, and I think 3 years ago too. And this year he couldn't come, and I'm kind of standing in his place now. I hope it will go well. But okay, the plan is like you can see on the screen. Sorry about that. Let's make it a little bit larger. So the plan is that we will first see some examples and describe them. Then we will go through a list of JavaScript gotchas that are really, really horrible, and you will learn to avoid them. Then we will talk about how objects are organized. Well, I won't read it for you. You can read it for yourself. As you can see, I don't have slides. It's mostly a workshop, so it's mostly up to you, and we will be mostly working with a JavaScript console. You need a JavaScript console. You can either use one from the command line. If you have a Mac, then you can just use JSC command to get a JavaScript console. Otherwise, you can, if you have Linux, you can install Rhino, or you can install Node.js to have a JavaScript console. And if you don't have either of them, or the network is malfunctioning again, you can just use the JavaScript console from the web browser. So if you have Chromium, for example, or Chrome, you can go to Tools, JavaScript console. And this will open JavaScript console. Now, please start your consoles, and if anybody has any trouble doesn't have a console or any kind of trouble, let me know. Raise your hand. I will come and help you with it. Because without this, we cannot really do anything else. So I will wait for a minute, maybe. JSC, JavaScript console.
Under system, library, framework, JavaScript, cordon framework,
Excellent. Not in fast.
No.
That's horrible. Thank you, Jobs. Okay. So if you can use the Rhino. RHINO. You can also let me see, Windows and Linux. If you have Windows, you can install this software. That's jsdb.org download, and they have JavaScript consoles for Windows, Mac, and Linux. I have them on the pen drive if somebody needs them. So just raise your hand and I will give it to you. Viruses included. So, does anybody have any trouble with the console? Raise your hand. Okay, one person. What system do you have? Okay. Okay, it looks like it will install. So. Okay, let's start with the example, because it's always easier to have something concrete. One more thing. The materials are available at readthedocs.org. If you search for, actually it's js4py.readthedocs.org. I wonder if I can make it. I can't zoom because I don't have copies, but yeah, I can type it here. .readthedocs.org, and that's where all the documentation is. Also, that's where you can get the examples if you want to try them on your computer. I will show everything on the screen, so you don't really need any files beside the JavaScript console on your computers, but you will probably want to come back to it at home to check for things and stuff like that. It's always the most recent updated versions, because it gets presented on different conferences and it's constantly updated. So I will make the font even bigger. Okay, is this big enough to see? People in the back? Okay, great. Okay, we will start with the example. Well, you probably want to learn JavaScript because it's used in browsers. So we will have an example from a web browser. But remember that JavaScript is a general purpose language. You can use it on the server too. You can use it to write standalone applications. Maybe it's not... it's a little bit clumsy for that, because it was initially designed for the web, but you can definitely do it. So I will cover the core language JavaScript things, and I will not cover the DOM or the browser-specific things. But I think that with the knowledge of the core language, you will already have much easier time learning all the web-related stuff. So we have our example counters, and as you can see, we include our JavaScript files in a script tag in the HTML, and we have some HTML elements in here that we will operate on. In particular, we have the div with an ID example here that we will replace with the output of our program. So we will only touch the things that are inside this div. Okay, I will show you how it looks like. We want something like this. I will restart it. Okay. So we have 4 different counters, and they count how many times they have been clicked. So if you click on them, the counter increases. That's the basic idea. And okay, that we won't be needed anymore. And we have some CSS to make it look a little bit nicer, but that doesn't matter. Right now we have the code here. And you can find this code on that read the docs site if you want to have it on your screen to see it exactly. We will discuss what different parts of it do. Okay, so first of all, we have this open parentheses and function at the beginning, and we have this strange set of characters at the end. This basically does a function definition in place, a little bit like Python lambda, and immediately at the end executes that function. We do that because in JavaScript every variable that is outside the function, like in Python, is global, and we don't want to pollute the global variable space with our variables. So we always, at least usually, we create a function, an anonymous function, and execute it in place. And okay. There are several convenience things in here. We have the create function. Because JavaScript was initially designed to look like Java, because of marketing reasons mostly, it uses the new keyword to create new objects. But since JavaScript has completely different object model than Java and than C++ and similar languages, this new keyword is completely works in a completely complicated way that's not very easy to understand. That's why we will not use it. We will use this create function that uses the new keyword inside and lets us forget about it. And what the function does, it takes the parent object as a parameter and creates another object that inherits from it. So we give it an object, and it will return an object that inherits from that object that we passed. We will talk in detail about how prototype-based inheritance work, but for now, just you don't have to understand what it does inside. It does some black magic. We will get to that too, if we have enough time. So this is a convenience method, and every JavaScript framework defines its own version of this create function, because it's so inconvenient to use the new keyword. So everybody uses that. So we will use it too. Second thing, from the convenience things, in JavaScript, the global namespace has a name, in the sense that it's actually a variable inside that namespace too. And you can always get the global namespace. Usually in browsers, the global namespace is called window, because it's usually tied to a single window. If you have a second window, it has a second global namespace. But if you are using a command line console, or you are using JavaScript on the server, they don't have this window variable. Instead, we can always get the global namespace by using this function. It's also a little bit of a hack. We will also get to how it works. Right now we just know that like this we can get the global function, the global namespace into the global variable. Every variable that is defined without the var keyword in JavaScript gets to this namespace. So that's pretty strange. Okay, we get to our counter class because we are doing proper object-oriented programming here. And JavaScript doesn't have classes. We call it class, but actually it's an object. It's an instance of an object. And we inherit from it. We inherit from other objects, not from classes. It's like having a different copy of the object. Except they are not really copied because there is no data duplication. JavaScript just checks our object for attribute or for method, and then if it doesn't find it, it goes to the parent object and checks for it. If it doesn't find it, it goes through the chain of inheritance up to the object, the topmost object. And here we define our parent object for our class, and it's an empty object. And we defined a constructor function that basically takes this counter object, calls create on it, and return calls init on it, so that we can use Python-like function names. We will have an init on our class that works like Python init. Okay, let's make it a little bigger. Sorry about that. Okay, we will call init on it and return it. And okay, the apply keyword lets us do something like the asterisk args and asterisk kw args do in Python. We can use it to call a method of one instance on a different instance, and with the arguments that we are providing. Okay, we will define once we have the counter object, we will start adding methods and properties to it. And we will do it by just assigning new methods and new functions to the empty object that we have. We will create on the note that we are adding the methods on the prototype object, not on the actual instance of our counter. So we add it to the prototype so that it's not going to be copied into every instance, but instead it will sit in single place. And well, this is Python-like init. and we will, as you were seeing, we call it in the constructor, so it works just like init in Python. We can add different things. Instead of self, we use this, and this is a little special. You can see it. There is no self in here, right? Like with Python. This is not a variable. It's a keyword, and it works in a certain special way that we get to it too. But for now, just treat it as self. And we can define an on-click function that just increments the count. And we have an HTML function that basically gives us HTML that we want to be displayed for this particular object. Now, in the browser, JavaScript is based on events. So, because we want to operate on the HTML tags that are inside our document, we cannot execute our code at the beginning, because the browser loads things in the order that they are in the document. So the tags are not yet there. We have to wait for all the documents to be loaded, and then we can start to execute our script. And to do that, we define a function that executes on load. There is a special onload event that will get executed by the browser when the document finishes loading. And then we can create our counters and put them in a list. And then we create the initial HTML that for the counters, and we find the div with the ID example, and we replace the inside of that div with our HTML. Okay. Then we will register another event on that element, on the on-click event for it. We will register a function that increments the counters appropriately, but we will not write a function for every model separately. Instead, we will use a factory function that returns functions. It's kind of tricky. We will get to that. And at the end, we will free the variable, so we are not clobbering the memory. And that's all for the onload function. The factory thing, I think I will actually go to that, come back to that later, because it's kind of complicated, and I want you to try your JavaScript first and get some more feeling about how this language works before we get to that. Oh, there's one thing. We are using this closing brace, close parent, open parent, close parent, semicolon thing. This is actually closing the function definition, closing the expression, and calling the function. Douglas Crockford, the god of JavaScript, recently said that he didn't like how it looks like. So he recommends using this construction instead. It's a stylistic matter. They both work the same way, so it's up to you. But Douglas Crockford said it, so it must be better. Actually, the guy is really involved with JavaScript, and he has a tremendous knowledge of this language. He wrote the book JavaScript, the good parts. There is this joke on the internet where you have two books next to each other. This thick, complete JavaScript, and this thin JavaScript, the good parts. And you really only need the good parts to write programs. And it's enough, and there are the parts that won't bite you. So I think that's quite a good idea. Okay, let's make it a little bit interactive. We will go through the JavaScript gotchas. We will start with equality because it's something you use very often. Do you know what this statement will do? Yeah. Well, just raise your hand or something. Well, the answer is more complicated than just. It looks like just a comparison, right? It's not just a comparison. That's the problem. What it does depends on what A and B are. Because, okay. You have some examples here. So 0 equals string with 0 in it. 0 equals empty string. 0 empty string doesn't equal the string 0. So it's not transitional, right? And undefined equals null. So if A doesn't exist in the current scope and B is null, then they are equal. Okay. So what happens here is that JavaScript implicitly converts everything, converts variables of different types, so that it never throws an error when we are trying to compare something. It will always try to compare them. And usually it tries to convert them to a string. Not always, as you can see. And the rules by which it does it are really complicated. And many people have tried to use that and failed. So just don't do that. There is a equals operator that works much better because it's reliable. It never converts. It compares both the type and the value of the variable, and if any of them is different, then it returns false. So if you compare a string with an int, even if both are 0, it will return false. There is a question here. Do you have a mic? Oh, okay, sorry. Okay. Yes? Nice. So
actually, Rhino thinks that empty string is equal 0.
Equals 0, yes, but not equal.
No, the other way around. First, the string 0.
Right.
Yeah, it's strange like that. It's really hard to wrap your head around that, and I don't even try. Just use the triple equals. And Douglas Crockford, the same guy who wrote that book about good parts of JavaScript, to make it easier for you to follow the good parts and avoid the bad parts, he wrote a program that will verify your JavaScript programs. It's called JSLength, and it will give you a warning if you use double equals anywhere. for example. So it's nice for finding the parts of your program that you think that how they are working, but you are wrong. Okay, addition. Is this code, is this the last line, true or false? Yes? Exactly. Okay, I will repeat that because, yeah. So, okay, then repeat.
As the when you use a plus b into parentheses and then c, depending on the type of a, b, and c, first you can have some casting due to the addition operator that could be weird, and then you compare x and y with the double equal operator, so then you can have another casting that can do like really messed up things.
Okay, so let's see the answers. There are some examples here. Yeah. So if we add a string to a number, we get a string. Okay, but if we try to add a number to a string, actually there is a pattern in JavaScript. If you do want to have a string, in a place where you would use str in Python, this cast to a string, right? Then you would just add whatever you have to an empty string. Empty string plus anything is always a string. It won't raise an exception, it won't error, it's always valid, and it will always give you some string. Sometimes it will just helpfully say object. Actually, most of the time it will just say object, and you have no idea what kind of object it is, but you will get a string. Okay. We have a trailing comma here. Do you know what will happen? How many items are there in this list? Actually, it depends on which browser you are using. Because on Mozilla browsers, the trailing comma is perfectly okay. It will treat it as in Python. But on certain big operating system creating, in IE, in any version of Internet Explorer, the trailing comma will just generate some really strange garbage in there. Actually, it will add an undefined element in there, but it won't be indexed in the array, because, okay, you will have an undefined attribute on the array object and not inside the array. This is a little fucked up, to be honest. Okay, what will happen if you miss the comma? I will spare you the suffering. It will try to interpret it as some kind of as if you are defining a list here and then trying to access its element. And because there is no element named 7, 8, 9 inside this array, it will return undefined. So the end result is you will have a list that has 1, 2, 3, comma, undefined. Okay, this is really bad. This is why we are avoiding the new keyword. If you have a constructor function in JavaScript and the one that is designed to be used with new, and you forget to put new in there, so you have these assignments here, but you are calling the function not on an object, but calling it just as a function, then those assignments will go to the global namespace. And you are clobbering your globals. And you can actually overwrite the variables and the functions you have already defined. Okay, another gotcha. If you have a method on an object and you assign that method to a variable, you know, in Python you can do that too. You can have variables that point to functions and to methods, right? And if you do that in JavaScript and call it, it's as if you are calling a function. It's the same thing as here. It doesn't know what object the method belongs to. Basically, the methods that you are having are not bound to the object. Oh, sorry. I should have made it bigger from the start, but every time I click it, it resets to the original size. Sorry about that. So, we have an array, and the array has a slice, a method that works basically like slices in Python work. A little bit like that. There are some differences. We'll talk about that. And if you assign it to a variable and call it like that, this will point to the global namespace, not to the object. Another gotcha. We have a new variable here, but we don't have the var keyword in front. Do you know what happens if you call this function? Exactly. Yes, we will have a global variable in the global namespace named total. And if you refer to the total again, it will be the same variable all over again. So it's especially bad if you have several functions like this, because they will interfere with each other. Okay, closures. This gotcha actually also works in Python. There was a guy who had it yesterday in his presentation. Basically, you are creating a function inside a function. Well, inside a loop. So you are creating functions. And the function inside it uses a variable that is itself declared outside the function. Can you tell me what this code would print? Well, what this code would show? You can try it in the console. Or
Will show the last value assigned to I in the whole loop?
exactly, yeah. That's because it's the same variable, right? So every time you create a new function, you do create a new function, but inside that function there is a reference to the same variable I. It doesn't make a copy. It keeps a reference to the same variable. So every function that you create keeps the same variable, and when you increase that variable, the variable increases in all the functions. And there is the same thing in Python. So there is no difference here, but it's a gotcha. Yes, it may be a bad practice in certain circumstances. We will talk about memory optimization, but this is. Oh, right. That's another gotcha we will have. So variable. There is another thing that's happening here, and that's basically. Actually, I'm missing the function keyword here. Nobody pointed that. Anyways, when you define the variable like here, you may think that it only exists inside the for loop. That's not true. This variable definition is moved here, and it's always in the in JavaScript. The namespace is always the function namespace.
If you modify E before the move, E starts already from another.
Well, no, because the assignment is still here. The assignment, it's like copied. It's not just moved. So that works as expected, but you have the variable I here and outside the loop, and it's still there. Anyway, to work around this problem with I, we have to call a function here. So we basically make a function that makes this function for us. This way, the n is actually copied every time. It's not the reference. It's the value then, and we have functions with different values. We will get back to that, so don't worry if that's a little hard to wrap your mind around. Closures are hard generally. There are in Python you use them sparingly. Sometimes they are very convenient, but sometimes they really make you think hard about what is happening. Here we have a similar problem. We have a function, and inside of it we have another function. This function is a method defined on this proto-object, right? So when we call it, this points to this proto-object. But not in this function anymore. Because this is not a variable, this is a keyword, and it's very dynamic in its nature. And because we are calling this function, well, this gets assigned at the moment that we are calling the function. If there is a dot, it gets assigned to the thing before the dot. But if there is no dot, but we call it like this, then this is the global object. It's actually a design mistake in JavaScript, and it's a very bad design mistake, but there is no way to change it now, so we have to live with that. And yeah, so this is problematic. So that's for the Go class for now. We will have a quick reminder of how things work in Python, because we will rely on that knowledge in later on, but I want to make sure that everybody has the same idea about what is happening in Python. So in Python you have basically two scopes that are important at any moment. You have more, but the two of them are the most important. It's the globals and the locals. The globals is basically your module, so it's your file. It's you can access it everywhere from your file, and it's constrained to your file. It doesn't go anywhere outside. And locals is the scope inside your function, basically. And by default, all assignments, when you have an assignment like this, they work in the local scope. So if you assign like this, even if there is a global variable y or y, even when there is a global variable y, you will get x assigned to the local variable y, and the global variable will get covered or shadowed, or how do you call it? And to actually access global variables, well, you can access them for reading, right? If there is a global variable x, you will read x here from the global scope. But to assign to global variables, you have to import them into the local scope with the global keyword. And there is no other way. Usually it's a bad practice to modify global variables inside functions. That's why this global keyword is very rarely used, and you almost never see it in any production code. So, but that's how it works. We will need to know that because we will compare it to how JavaScript works. Okay, in Python the default scope is always the local scope. So when you are creating a new variable, it always goes to the local scope. In JavaScript it goes to the global scope by default. In Python you can pass functions as parameters. They are normal values like any other object, and you can pass them as parameters, you can store them in variables, you can put them into dictionaries, you can put them into lists, you can have a list of functions, no problem. That's also something that beginning Python programmers don't realize, and that's why the decorators are so hard to understand, because they operate on the functions as parameters. So for the an example is the sort method on the strings or the lists. Sorry, strings don't have a sort method. On the list, where you can pass a function as the key argument, and then it will use that for sorting. For example, if you want to sort without looking at the case of the letters, we'll just pass the lowercase function as our comparing function. Well, it's not the comparing function, it's the key function. So it basically, before comparing elements, it calls that function on them and compares the results. And because we always return the lowercase version of the element, it will compare them with ignoring case. In JavaScript, you can also pass function as variables, as parameters, but there is this trick with this becoming null, becoming the global scope. So we will have to be careful about that. Method binding. You can pass not only functions, but methods in Python. And the method will remember what object it belongs to. That is very important. If you have some method in a variable, it will know what object it came from. So we have a function here that just calls whatever was passed to it with the a parameter. And we call it with mylist append as the parameter. You can try it in Python console if you like. And if you print mylist, actually, I will show you. Work. So we have some function that just calls something like this. We have list, and we will call like this. And then if we look at the list, we see that it's as if C append A was called, right? The important thing is that we didn't pass C to this function. We just passed the method. And the method remembers on which object it sits. Okay? In JavaScript, it doesn't remember that. Closures. This is the hard to wrap your head around thing. And okay, so this is kind of convoluted use that could maybe be useful. Use of closures. Suppose we have an object, and suppose we don't want users of that other programmers to be able to get and set values on that. So we can make something like this. We create a function that has some variable in it. And apart from the variable, that function also has inside it two other functions. So the functions created inside the function, in the local scope. Those functions are not available anywhere outside. And they do something with the value. Basically, they either return it or assign to it. And then we can return them from the function. Now, what happens when we do this? Actually, I will copy it and... Okay. Excellent. Okay, so we have our function with the get and set defined, and if we call it, we have two functions: get, that gets the value, and set, that sets the value. Sets the value. And if we call get again, I did something wrong here.
In Python, you can, when you assign, you always create a local. If you want to capture
Yeah.
a local from the upper scope, you have to use a local, like a list and append to the list.
Okay. Let's do it like that. Right. So let's make the value like this. Yeah. Okay, then we can call get to get it, and we can call set to set it. Okay, that works. And the point is, there is absolutely no other way to get to that value. You have only those two functions, and there is no way without the inspect module, because the inspect. Yes, can you pass the mic? Behind the column.
Actually, there is a way. You can use g נקודה underscore closure underscore in
Yeah,
the
yeah. Well, the inspection thing. You can either do it with inspect module to get to that frame, or you can go to the system
I use it quite,
things.
I use it quite a lot of time when debugging code with closures.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. The point is, you can't. Okay, you can get there by inspecting the objects, right? The functions and the locals and things like that. Actually, in JavaScript you can't, but that's another point. But there is no way to get to it normally, as if you were reading a normal program. And what is happening here is that this scope from this function, even though the function was called and doesn't exist anymore, the scope still exists and has all the variables that were defined here. And it lives somewhere in memory as long as we have reference to this get and set functions, because those functions have references to those variables. So it's easy to get a memory leak like that, because if we create a lot of those, if you call make set a lot of times and put it on different things, we have this scope in memory sitting there all the time until we release those functions. But it's really convenient for all sorts of callback functions, because we don't have to, it's really easy to create a new function that has some values inside it, embedded in it. So that's how it works in Python, and it works in very similar way in JavaScript. Just remember that the scope of that function still lives in the memory somewhere, and those functions inside it still have access to it. Okay. Yeah, this is as example of using that with an object. And here it will work much better, because we actually have self.value. We don't have to. Okay, spare arguments. You know that you can have okay, I will make it bigger. You can define a function like this, and then it takes any number of arguments you want, right? Like in C there is really convoluted way to define those functions, like print. And you can also make it take keyword arguments, any kind of them, with double asterisks. And then args will be a list, and the key W args will be a dictionary. And yeah, that's basically how it works. There is one important thing that keywords always have to be after the positional arguments. And in Python 2, I think the keywords cannot be invalid. The dictionary that you are passing cannot have keys that are invalid variables, invalid variable names. So it can only have strings that have valid as a variable names and cannot be Unicode. But in Python 3 you can pass Unicode strings as keys, and you can pass anything. So you can have spaces in there, you can have accented characters, you can have Chinese. And then you can also call a function with a list of arguments or with a dictionary of arguments in very similar way, right? Okay, that's all we need to know from from Python. Now we'll talk about objects. In Python we have separate objects and dictionaries. In JavaScript both things are the same thing. So an empty dictionary is an empty object, basically. And there are... Okay, we will talk about this late news later. Okay, if you have a dict in Python, you can store different things under keys, under different keys in it. And in similar way you can do it with JavaScript, with one gotcha. Well, with many gotchas actually. The keys in JavaScript can only be strings. You cannot use anything else for the keys. In Python you can use tuples, for example. You can use frozen sets. Anything that is not mutable can be used as a key in Python dictionary. And in JavaScript you always get strings. If you use something that is not a string, like here, JavaScript will silently turn it into a string. And because, as I said before, many JavaScript objects will just convert to the string object, you can get really surprised that everything you put in your dictionary gets in the same slot. Yeah, here is a more surprising one. So you have two dictionaries and two objects, and you use them as keys, and they basically turn into the same string. If you do it like this, and you turn it into a string, it's object. And if you make another one and also turn it into a string, you also get object. So both of those are the same string. Yeah, exactly. And most, even the built-in types in JavaScript don't define their own string conversion functions. So usually you get this. It's really, JavaScript is written with those. Everything you try to inspect suddenly is object, and you have no idea what it has inside. Yeah, okay. Well, with Python you couldn't do that because objects are obviously mutable and cannot be used as keys, but you could use frozen sets or tuples instead, and then it would just work. Those would be different keys. Aha! Another thing. In Python you get an error. In JavaScript it just silently does something that doesn't make sense. It's a common pattern in JavaScript. It's designed to keep on plugging no matter what. It's designed to avoid throwing errors at all costs. And it bites. It really bites. It makes debugging very hard because you have to track where did that come from, and you have to go back and try to understand what is happening. Okay. If you try to access a key that is not there in the dictionary, or in the object in case of JavaScript, in Python you will get a key error. In JavaScript you will get a value back, but the value is undefined. Because everything, you can refer to non-existing variables in JavaScript and things like that, and they all have the value undefined. And the funny thing, this variable, undefined, it has type undefined, same as, I don't know, but you can do this. Okay, I cannot do this in this particular Python shell. Let's try it with defined. Seems like they fixed it, but in the actual specification of JavaScript, undefined is not a keyword. Undefined is not a special value. It's just any other variable. And it's undefined because it's not defined anywhere. By coincidence, it has the value of undefined because it is undefined. And I see they fixed it now, but it was a very easy way to break JavaScript programs by defining undefined. And then you would get some value. Can you pass the microphone? Then you would get some value instead of undefined, and all the program logic would break.
So basically what you're saying is that if you say undefined equals to 42, then everything which is not defined will be equal to 42?
No. Just the programs that are using the name undefined to check if something is undefined.
Okay, that would have been cool though, but okay, thank you.
Unfortunately, the value for undefined is really deep in JavaScript, and you can change that. So there is this pattern to not check for equality with undefined, but to check in, I think we'll get to it. Okay, I will have to check my notes, but it's something like void something that always returns undefined, and you can't change that. Okay. Yeah, there are a million ways of getting at the undefined value. But this is really this really shows how JavaScript really was designed. I don't know if you know, but JavaScript was designed in 10 days. The guy got a task, design a scripting language for the web, and he got 10 days to do it. And I think that considering the time constraints, he really did a great job. JavaScript is really interesting language with a lot of great features that weren't anywhere else at the time. Many things that Python has were there already in JavaScript. So good work, I say. But once it was deployed into the web browsers and everybody started to use it, it cannot be changed anymore. So we can't change the bad parts of it. So we just have to live with it somehow. Okay, attributes. In Python you can take an object and say object.attribute equals something, and you have attribute defined on that. In JavaScript you can do that too, but it's the same way as using a dictionary. There is no difference, right? You can assign to a dictionary and read from an attribute, or you can assign to an attribute and read from a dictionary, and it's exactly the same thing. I see that you are a little bit bored because I'm not doing it the right way. You should be trying those things in your consoles. If you could do that. I'm sorry about that. I forgot to tell you it. Because if you are just sitting and looking, it doesn't register in the head. So if you could try this snippet. Yeah, exactly. I just forgot about that. Sorry. The only difference between them is that if you are using the dot, you have to use a name that is a valid JavaScript name. So you can't have spaces in there or strange accented characters or I don't know, plus, minus, equals, things like that. Here you can use any string you want. Okay, because of that, we don't need getAttr or setAttr functions. You know, in Python, if you want to get to, if you define some object, and you set some attribute on it, and you want to refer it by name that is in some string, and you don't know the string at the compilation time or at the time of writing the program, then you can use getAttr. GetAttr. Right, and you can even have a default value. So if you access something that isn't there, it will give you that default value. And similar setAttr. Will let you set it. In JavaScript, that's completely useless. You don't need that. Because you just do your object and just do it like this, and it's completely the same thing. Okay. And you can do the same thing with functions. So methods on the objects in JavaScript are basically just attributes that have functions as their values. Okay, as I said before, JavaScript has completely different inheritance model, different... Yes? Can you pass the mic? Excuse me?
A very quick question.
Please wait for the mic, so that it records.
Sorry you've moved on, but it was a quick question about the reference in the object, the last page. I've got a shell. Is it right if you pass a key that doesn't exist? I've got reference error, which is good with my JavaScript shell.
Oh,
Is that what you expect as a sea monkey shell?
you get reference error because it tried to print the value in the console and it got undefined.
I see.
But if you assign it to something, there won't be an error.
I see.
That something will just get the value undefined.
Okay, thanks.
This is something built into the console to make your life easier.
Joel, when I test it on the console, if I do, if I do a var p equals q,
Yeah.
I get reference error. Only if I do var p equals p, I get undefined.
Okay, maybe
Is
they...
that only on the console? That even in functions defined on the console, if I do if I do var p equals q, I get an error.
Okay, yeah.
In the browser,
We can check it later, okay? Because I don't... well, or maybe check it now. So we are getting something like this. And we have reference error. Because we are in the global namespace. Okay, let's do something like this. So the global object in the console has some additional handling for the undefined to make your life easier when you access the undefined variable. But if you access something undefined on the object, you still get undefined. And if you, well, yeah. I wonder if I do that. Yeah. So you are not getting there. Seems like the console has some convenience things for accessing undefined things on the global objects. But you cannot really on that, because in the browser it will just give you undefined. Okay. So the idea in JavaScript for object inheritance is that there are no classes. We don't need no classes. We just have objects that are our prototypes. And when we want to make a new object that has the same properties as some existing object, we just inherit from that object. So Jonathan Fine has recently discovered that, well, not noticed, more like, that this is a lot like classes in Python. So you can think about JavaScript objects in the way you think about classes that you never instantiate. So they have superclasses, you inherit from, and they have some attributes on them. And if you access an attribute on the class that isn't there, it will check the superclass and the next superclass and so on, and only after it gets to the top, to the object, and it's not there, it will give you an error that it's not there. Well, in JavaScript you will get undefined. Okay, so here is an example. We have a root object that we will use as our prototype. Basically an empty object. And we have this create function. It's the same function that we had in the example at the beginning. It basically creates a new object that inherits from the parameter. Let's try that. I will just copy that function because I'm lazy. Okay, we will have the root object, and we will create one object and second one, and now we can add an attribute to the to our root object and see that it's there on both of our instances. You can think of this as a class and those as instances, but it's not really exactly like that. Those are all objects, and you can use any one of them as an object. Now, if I do something like this, it's not there. Because if we look at the inheritance tree, B doesn't inherit from A. It only inherits from root. And if you do that with Python, it works exactly the same way. You can monkey patch the classes. Normally you don't monkey patch classes because normally you would define them as something that you don't modify later. But in JavaScript there is no way to do that like that. You always just add things to it, or use the object literal. Okay, so the type operator. This is an operator. This is not a function, and we use it. Actually, Jonathan uses it as function. So maybe oh, I see. Jonathan uses it as a function because this is Python. Okay, this is a Python example. Sorry about that confusion. Okay, because what we said before, the attribute and the dot and the square brackets is the same in JavaScript, we can just define custom methods like this, and to do the same thing in Python, you would need to create get item and set item. In JavaScript, there is no way to override the dot or the square brackets operator. In Python, we can override them and make them do something else, right? Often some really strange things. In JavaScript, we can't. It always does the same thing. Access the inside of the object. Okay. Meta class. Yes?
The information just spreads around here how to get to the version of the HTML page that you are showing. So maybe you might announce one or two things again, because where you pointed us in the beginning is just a kind of an older version.
Older?
So on read the docs, it's
Oh,
a different one.
no. Okay, I see what you mean. Yes, if you go to the schedule and you click on this JavaScript for Pythonistas and click on this, I put in the comments a link to the archive with all my all my materials. Sorry about that. But the version on the read the docs, it's not outdated. It's just it starts in a different place. Yeah, because the whole documentation is a little bit bigger than I'm showing you, and there are different starting points. But everything that I'm showing is here, but organized a little different. So if you come back home and you want to check something, you will have everything on the read the docs. So don't worry about that. Anyways, there is a. I will make that bigger, so you can just. Yeah. When I was preparing this, I just put it on the Bitbucket, so you can download it from here. Anyways. I think I will skip that because this is a trick in Python to make the Python classes behave exactly like JavaScript classes. And we don't really want that. We want to learn how JavaScript works. It's an interesting piece to read, so maybe read it at home. Okay, about functions. We have two ways of defining a function in JavaScript. We can define it with the function keyword and a name and then the list of parameters, or we can define it like this in place, like lambda. The difference with lambda is that we can use anything inside the body, so it's not just expressions. In Python we can use only expressions inside the lambda. We don't have the star args and star kw args arguments, but we can use the arguments keyword. It's again like this. It's not a variable, it's a keyword, but it will give us something that kind of behaves like an array of arguments, but it's not an array. We will get to that. So usually we define methods like that, so we just monkey patch them on the object. And we can also do it like this. We can just have an object literal which looks like dict in Python and have the function as the value for the keys. It's best avoided because it's not very readable and it's easy to forget to leave a comma at the end. And we have seen what happens then. Okay. We can also declare it like this. This looks like def in Python. The problem with this is similar to the problem with var. This definition gets hoisted to the top of the scope. So even though we declare the function at the end of our file, JavaScript will take it and move it to the top. So, no, to the top of the scope in which we are. Oh, then I'm misinformed. Let's check it. Okay, so we have some function, and we will make something like that. Return 3. Okay, and then we can try to call f. It's not going into the global. It's not that bad. It goes to the top of the current scope. So that it's intentional so that we can write some code calling some functions and then say, wait, I forgot to define this function. Let's define it. And so you can have, like in C, you have main at the bottom of your file. The main function, right? Anyways, because of this behavior, it's confusing. Better not use it. Better always do this, like this. It's the same number of characters. Well, maybe the equal sign is additional, but it's a small price to pay. And you can call that function in several ways. You can call it directly, like normally in Python, and that's the normal function call. You can. This looks like the same thing, but note that there is a period here, and that makes this obj being assigned to this inside the function. It happens at the call time, right? And you can also use the call and apply methods, and they work kind of like the args and kw args parameters. Call lets you provide your own this. So it lets you say, okay, call it on that method, but you as self use a different self, like you sometimes do when you are using super. And apply does the same thing, but it accepts an array as the argument. So it's like kw args or maybe more like args. There are no keywords arguments in JavaScript. But there are optional arguments. And they are always optional, basically. If you have a function like this, well, let me demonstrate. If we make a function that takes A, B, and C, and returns B, and call it with just one argument, the B will be undefined. So arguments are always optional, and if they are not provided, they are undefined. You can also call it with as many arguments as you want. It won't mind. So, yeah, keep on tagging at all cost. Yeah, we can call a method the usual way, or you can use the square brackets if you have the method name as a string. It doesn't matter. JavaScript doesn't care. In both ways, if you have your object and you put a method on it, and we call it, you see that it returns the object. We return this. This is the object on which we call it. But if you do something like this and then call it, you will get the global object. Because this is defined at the moment you are calling. If there is a period in the function call, or there is a square bracket at the function call, it's the same thing. It assigns this to the object on which it's sitting. In Python, it's similar, but it assigns to self at the moment you access it. So if you do o.f, it already binds it to the object. The official term for that is binding. And JavaScript does late binding, so it binds at the last possible moment when there is a call. Python binds it as soon as you use the dot. That's the gotcha here. Oh, and we can force to use a different this. So when we have this XXX that we have broken because it returns the global object, we can call it with on our object. We can force. We can do it also with strings, for example. So the string has, for example, the slice method, right? And we can call it on our object. It does something strange because our object is not really, this method is not really designed to work with our object, but this sometimes comes in handy. There are some methods on array, for example, that you could use on the strings, but they are not on the strings. And you can, this way you can call a method of a different object on your object. Okay. Okay. There is another gotcha. If we call this call on something that is not an object, this is strange. Okay, so obviously my documentation says that if you do that, you should get the global object. As we can see in my console, that's Node.js, you get an empty object. So we can safely assume that the behavior is undefined. Anything can happen. Jonathan probably tested it on Rhino or on Mozilla Firefox. Anyways, it's probably not what you want. Okay, we still have 20 minutes, so let's discuss this, because this is very interesting. It's almost like self in Python, but not quite. And the devil is in the details. If you have so far did something with JavaScript, you probably have some idea of how this works, but it has probably surprised you many times. And I think it's very important to understand how this works, because it's not that complicated, and it will save you a lot of head scratching. First of all, this is not a variable. It's not like self, which is explicit variable in Python, and just the name is just the tradition. This is actually a keyword in JavaScript. You cannot assign to it. I will make it bigger again. Shout at me if I forget to make a page bigger. Actually, JavaScript has a lot of those keywords that behave like variables. It has this, it has attributes. There are a couple of them. I cannot list them from the top of my head, but you can recognize them by the fact that you cannot assign to them. Okay. The only way, well, not the only way. The most usual way of changing this is by calling a method on an object. So if you call something that has a period in it, oh, that's not what it says. Okay, we will get to that in a moment. There is a trick. You can actually change the value of the you can change the value that this keyword points to, and this describes this trick. I don't know if it's that important because it's not really useful in actual coding, but it's nice to know that you can actually change the value of this. You can pull a prank on a friend with that. Anyways, the usual way of setting this is by calling something with a period in it. If you are calling something without a period, then this is set to undefined. In this previous example, when we mutated this, we have added a name to it in some convoluted way. And what we have done, we actually added that name to the global scope, because this was pointing to the global scope at that moment. Outside the functions, outside any function calls, this points to the global scope. Inside the function calls, if it was called as a function, it still points to the global scope. If it was called with a period as a method on some object, it will point to that object. And in web browsers, if we have an event handler, and the event is attached to some HTML element, and the event gets fired, and our function or callback gets called, then it gets called with this set to the HTML element on which the callback was attached. So, okay. So it's very easy to break your global scope using this in the wrong way. And blah blah blah, I think we know this already. Yeah, the two other ways to change how this behaves is the call and apply methods that we have seen before. And that's all. I think we want to do some testing, some creating of functions, and well, if you could create a function that returns this, and then try to put it on different objects and call in different ways and see what happens, because we still have 5 minutes until the break, or you can just leave for the coffee, and we will continue this after the break. So the function would be something like that. Get this. And return this. Okay, and then we can create an object, put get this on that object and call it, and we see that we are getting that object. Actually, if we put some name on it, we can see that this is indeed the object we have. And if we call that function directly, we get the global object. And that's exactly what we did in the example at the beginning when we wanted to have global. We just get this. And we have our global. Okay. We can call it with apply. Or with call on our O object instead, or on our object. Or we can put our O object on the object and get this on that. And then we can call that. Oh, yeah, I did a call here. Yeah. Obviously, the functions also have return values, and if they don't have the return statement in them, they return undefined. So if we make a function that doesn't have a return, and we call it, it's just undefined. Or we can return anything we want. Type of Also, this is a very good time for questions, or if you are making some experiments and you don't get what you are getting back. Wait, there is a... Sorry.
Hello. Hi. It's a question about what's coming up next. Is it in your talk about why closures are important in JavaScript?
Yes.
That's something I don't understand.
We will get to closures, we will get to delegation and how you actually make objects. Because you cannot make private functions, private attributes on an object without closures in JavaScript.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. You said that a function declaration should never be used.
Well, not necessarily never, but it's better avoided because it's confusing.
Yes, I need a reason. I can't understand why the function declaration should never be used.
Well, it does some magical changing of reordering of your code, right?
Yes, I understand when you define a function like var a equals function.
Yeah. Well, if you do this equals thing, it gets executed exactly at the point where you wrote it.
Yes.
And if you do this function name parentheses thing, it always gets moved to the top of the current scope.
And yes, and I don't understand why that's bad.
Well, it can really bite you in surprising way when you don't expect that. And it's easy to forget about that. Yeah. Later on, when we are constructing classes, you will see that the order in which you are declaring your functions may be very important. Because there are closures, you are referring to variables from the outer scopes, and those variables might not yet exist or might have wrong values and things like that. And, well, generally, Douglas Crockford, when he now moved to PayPal, he had a talk about style, about programming style. And he said that if you have two ways of doing something that are roughly equivalent, but one of those ways allows you to avoid certain mistake, then always choose the other one. Well, choose the one that lets you avoid them mistakes. Sorry. And especially if the mistake is rare and really strange, because when you get to the situation when it matters, you are sure to not remember about that. Okay, you had a question. Let's wait for the mic.
Where?
Here.
Okay.
So you showed us 2 equals and 3 equals. Is there an equivalent in JavaScript to is in Python?
There is...
to clarify, is...
Yeah, I know.
Yes,
what
but for people who are watching, is for making sure that 2 objects are exactly the same object and not only compare to equal.
I must say that I don't know. I never needed that. I think that in this okay, for objects, you can use triple equals, and it will only return true if it's the same exact object. But it only applies to things that are actually objects in JavaScript and not literals, not things like values, like scalars. Because for scalars it will just compare the type and value. So the answer is kind of yes and no. It works for objects, it doesn't work for any value.
Including arrays.
Including
Arrays. Lists.
I think no. Let's check it. Let's make an array. And let's not forget new. And let's make a second array. And at least one. And let's see. Yeah, that's including arrays. That's pretty bad. I guess there is a function for comparing arrays in terms of containing the same. So arrays are different even if they have the same content. Anyone else?
Someone else? No? So do we want to make the
The coffee break.
The coffee break?
Yeah.
Oh, so the coffee break runs until 5:15, right? And we can choose to finish earlier if we want to start earlier or something. I mean, it's up to you if you want to continue
I
earlier
think
than...
we have pretty good tempo.
Yeah? So it's
That's
okay
my fault actually, because we didn't do the exercises at the beginning. But I think we will manage just fine. So see you at 5:15.
Okay, so the regular coffee break. Thank you very much.